when I choked the words back. My fuel had run out halfway down the runway. I'd never have made Miriam 10 miles away. I'd have crashed in the field short of a touchdown. We stopped at the officers' mess and went in. The place had seen better days. My host, Flight Lieutenant Marks, shrugged off his sheepskin coat and threw it over a chair. "I'm sorry it's not very hospitable, old boy," said Marks, going to the door and shouting for someone called Joe. "Not to worry," I said, though I could do with a bath and a meal. "I think we can manage that," he said, trying hard to play the genial host. "I'll get Joe to fix up a spare room. God knows we have enough of them. He'll also rustle up a meal. Bacon and eggs do?" "That'll do fine. While I'm waiting, do you mind if I use your phone?" He ushered me into the mess secretary's office and then went off to supervise the steward. My watch told me it was close to midnight. Hell of a way to spend Christmas, I thought. Then I recalled how 30 minutes earlier I had been crying to God for help, and I felt ashamed. After a few minutes, the phone was ringing.
RAF Miriam St. George.
"Duty controller, air traffic control, please," I said. There was a pause.
I'm sorry, sir, but I'm afraid there's no flying tonight, sir. No one on duty in air traffic control.
"Then give me the station duty officer, please." When I got through to him, I explained about the emergency and that his station had been alerted to receive a vampire fighter coming in on emergency landing without radio. He listened attentively.
I don't know about that. I don't think we've been operational since we closed down at 5 this afternoon. But I'm not on air traffic. I'll get the wing commander flying.
An older voice came on the line.
Where are you speaking from?
RAF Minton, sir. I've just made an emergency landing here. I thought I was heading for your airfield on a ground-controlled approach.
Well, make up your mind. Were you or weren't you? You want to know.
I took a deep breath and started at the beginning. So you see, sir, I was intercepted by the weather plane from Gloucester, and he brought me in. But in this fog, it must have been on a GCA, no other way to get down. Yet when I saw the lights of Minton, I landed, assuming it to be Miriam St. George. I'm ringing to alert you to stand down your radar and air traffic control crews, sir. They must be waiting for a vampire that's never going to arrive. It's already arrived here at Minton.
But we shut all the systems down at 5 o'clock. There's been no call for us to turn out.
But Miriam St. George has a GCA?
I know we have, but it's been shut down since 5 o'clock.
I asked the next and last question slowly and carefully. Do you know, sir, where is the nearest RAF station that maintains 24-hour emergency listening?
Yes. To the west, RAF Marham. To the south, RAF Lakenheath. Good night to you. Happy Christmas.
I put the phone down. Marham was 40 miles away on the other side of Norfolk. Lakenheath was well over 40 miles to the southwest, in Suffolk. On the fuel I was carrying, not only could I not have made Miriam St. George, it wasn't even open. It began to dawn on me that I didn't really owe my life to the weather pilot from Gloucester, but to beery, bumbling old passed-over Flight Lieutenant Marks, who couldn't tell one end of an aircraft from another. Still, the mosquito must be back at Gloucester by now, and he ought to know that despite everything, I was alive.
Gloucester?
Said the operator.
At this time of night?
Yes, I replied firmly. Gloucester, even at this time of night. The duty meteorologist took the call and I explained the position to him.
I'm afraid there must be some mistake, flying officer,
He said.
It could not have been one of ours. Our mosquitoes went out of service 3 months ago. We now use Canberras.
I stared at the telephone in disbelief. Then an idea came to me. What happened to them?
They were scrapped, I think, or sent off to museums, more likely.
Could one of them been sold privately, I asked.
Well, I suppose it's possible.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And happy Christmas. I put the phone down and shook my head in bewilderment. What an incredible night. First, I lose my radio and all my instruments. Then I get lost and short of fuel. Then I'm taken in tow by some moonlighting harebrain with a passion for veteran aircraft, flying his own mosquito through the night, who happens to spot me, comes within an inch of killing me, and finally a half-drunk ground duty officer has the sense to put his runway lights on in time to save me. Luck doesn't come in much bigger slices. Flight Lieutenant Marks put his head through the doorway. Your room's ready, he said. Number 17 just down the corridor. Joe's making up a fire. The bath water's heating. If you don't mind, I think I'll turn in. Will you be all right on your own? Yes, sure, I'll be fine. Many thanks for all your help. I took my helmet and wandered down the corridor. From the doorway of 17, a bar of light shone into the passage. As I entered the room, an elderly man began to rise from his knees in front of the fireplace. Good evening, sir, I said. I'm Joe, sir, the mess steward. Yes, Joe, Mr. Marks told me about you. Sorry to cause you so much trouble at this hour of the night. I just dropped in, as you might say. Yes, Mr. Marks told me. I'll have your room ready directly. Soon as this fire burns up, it'll be quite cozy. While I ate the plate of sizzling bacon and eggs, the old steward stayed to talk. You been here long, Joe? I asked him, more out of politeness than genuine curiosity. Oh, yes, sir. Nigh on 20 years now. Since just before the war, when the station opened. He told me of the days when the rooms were crammed with eager young pilots, the dining room noisy, the bar roaring with bawdy songs of months and years, when the sky above the airfield snarled to the sound of piston engines, driving planes to war and bringing them back again. I rose from the table, fished a cigarette from the pocket of my flying suit, lit it, and sauntered around the room. The steward began to tidy up the plates. I halted before an old photograph in a frame standing on the mantel above the crackling fire. I stopped with my cigarette half raised to my lips, feeling the room go suddenly cold. The photo was old, but it was still clear enough. It showed a young man in his early 20s, dressed in flying gear, but not the grey suits and plastic crash helmets of today. He wore thick, sheepskin-lined boots, rough serge trousers, and a heavy sheepskin zip-up jacket. From his left hand dangled one of the soft leather flying helmets they used to wear, with goggles attached instead of the modern pilot's tinted visor. He stood with legs apart, right hand on hip, a defiant stance, but he was not smiling. There was something sad about his eyes. Behind him stood his aircraft. There was no mistaking the lean, sleek silhouette of the Mosquito fighter bomber. I was about to say something to Joe when I felt the gust of cold air on my back. One of the windows had blown open. It took me 2 strides to cross to where the window swung on its steel frame. To get a better hold, I stepped inside the curtain and stared out. Somewhere, far away in the fog, I thought I heard the snarl of engines. But it was probably just a motorcycle of some farm boy. I closed the window, made sure it was secure, and turned back into the room. Who's the pilot, Joe? I nodded toward the lonely photograph on the mantel. That's a photo of Mr. John Kavanagh, sir. He was here during the war, sir. An Irish gentleman, very fine man, if I may say so. As a matter of fact, sir, this was his room. What squadron was that, Joe? I was still peering at the aircraft in the background. Pathfinders, sir. Mosquitoes they flew. Very fine pilots, all of them, sir. But I believe Mr. Johnny was the best of them all. But then I'm biased, sir. I was his Batman, you see. There was no doubting it. The faint letters on the nose of the Mosquito behind the figure in the photo read J.K. Not Jig King, but Johnny Kavanagh. The whole thing was clear as day. Kavanagh had been a fine pilot, flying with one of the crack squadrons during the war. After the war, he'd made a pile of money, bought an old Mosquito in one of the periodic auctions of obsolescent aircraft, refitted it, and flew it privately whenever he wished. Not a bad way to spend your spare time if you had the money. So he'd been flying back from some trip to Europe, had spotted me turning in triangles above the cloud bank, realized I was stuck, and taken me in tow. Pinpointing his position precisely by crossed radio beacons. Knowing this stretch of the coast by heart, he'd taken a chance on finding his old airfield at Minton, even in the thick fog. It was a hell of a risk. But then, I had no fuel left, so it was that or bust. I had no doubt I could trace the man, probably through the Royal Aero Club. He was certainly a good pilot, I said reflectively, thinking of this evening's performance. Oh, the best, sir, said old Joe. They reckon he had eyes like a cat, did Mr. Johnny. I recall many's a time the squadron return, he'd have his Mosquito refueled and take off again alone, going back over the Channel or the North Sea to see if he could find some crippled bomber making for the coast and guide it home. I've seen pictures of them, I said. and he used to guide them back. I could imagine them in my mind's eye, gaping holes in the body, the wings and the tail, creaking and swaying as the pilot sought to hold them steady for home, a wounded or dying crew on the radio shot to bits. I turned from the photograph and stubbed my cigarette butt into the ashtray by the bed. Quite a man, I said, and I meant it. Even today, middle-aged, he was a superb flyer. Oh, yes, sir. Quite a man, Mr. Johnny. I nodded gravely. The old man so obviously worshipped his wartime officer. Well, I said, by the look of it, he's still doing it. Now Joe smiled. Oh, I hardly think so, sir. My Johnny went out on his last patrol Christmas Eve, 1943, just a mite over 14 years ago tonight. He never come back, sir. Went down with his plane somewhere in the North Sea, he did. Good night, sir. Happy Christmas.